We begin the day with a U.S.-led effort to limit China's monopoly over much of the world's supply of critical minerals. Lithium, cobalt, and graphite, just to name a few, may not top the list of geopolitical weapons, but they are the components that make our 21st century high-tech world, from smartphones to car batteries, possible. As it stands tonight, China has a stranglehold over most of the market, and Beijing does not shy away from making the point to other countries. In response, the U.S. is launching its own trading bloc to try and shore up supply chains. Today, more than 50 countries attended talks in Washington aimed at getting them on board. Here's how the Trump administration is selling MAGA multilateralism.
The Trump administration is proposing a concrete mechanism to return the global critical minerals market to a healthier, more competitive state. A preferential trade zone for critical minerals protected from external disruptions through enforceable price floors.
This initiative here today may be one that started with us, but this is not solely an American initiative. This must be an international, global initiative with like-minded countries who all have one thing in common. We want to see a diverse supply of critical minerals and a secure and resilient supply chains across the world so all of our economies can prosper without ever having these things be susceptible, at worst case scenario, being used as leverage against us, or any other disruption that could come to the market that would undermine our collective economic security.
Well, I'm joined now by Olena Borodyna. She's a researcher at ODI Global, where she tracks the geopolitics of critical minerals and how supply chains are reshaping global power. Olena, it's good to have you with us. First, some clarity here. Critical minerals are not the same as rare earths. I mean, rare earths are just one subset, but when we blur that line, what are we getting wrong and why does it matter?
I suppose, first of all, thank you for having me here. I suppose it's useful to understand the distinction because we're talking about different minerals and metals to begin with, but the supply chains for those minerals and metals look very different, and the extent of China's domination, for example, of those minerals is also quite different. So I think if we're thinking about critical raw material strategies, we need to be thinking about quite distinct groups of minerals and metals and their supply chains, and the actions and the actors that are involved in those supply chains are also quite different.
I understand that China has this virtual monopoly over many of these resources. Why is that a concern for other governments around the world?
Yes, that's right. China has virtual monopoly on both production and processing of some of those materials, particularly in rare earth. And what we've seen over the past decade is that China has been increasingly looking to use and leverage its dominance of those supply chains as a geoeconomic tool. Most recently, in 2025, we've seen that China has successfully leveraged its dominance of those supply chains in trade negotiations with the U.S. And Project Volt, which President Trump has announced this week, is looking to address some of those concerns.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that. The U.S. wants to create a critical minerals trading bloc with its allies, explicitly to loosen China's grip on supply chains. Do you think that this strategy will succeed?
I think the U.S., especially the second Trump administration, has been moving quite decisively to loosen China's grip of those supply chains. We've seen in 2025, the U.S. taking equity stakes in some of the raw materials projects. We've seen the U.S. sign trade partnerships with quite a number of actors. I think the U.S. has been less successful in building alliances because some of its moves have been quite unilateral. So it remains to be seen to what extent is going to be the U.S.-led Project Volt project and whether it will involve allies or it's going to be focused on the U.S., in which case it's probably going to be quite successful at bringing in those resources to the country. The question is what will that mean for allies and indeed how China is going to respond.
Yeah, and when we're talking about this Project Volt, I mean, it is strategic stockpiling that the U.S. wants to do. And what does stockpiling, what does it do? Does it create leverage for the U.S. or does it reveal vulnerabilities?
So it's a little bit of both. it is a vulnerability for the US, both a defense vulnerability, but also an economic security vulnerability, in that it is dependent on China, and China can leverage those resources to and implement export controls to undermine US defense buildup, for example. But we also need to start addressing some of those vulnerabilities. So creating a strategic stockpile does give you leverage. If you are in trade negotiations, for example, if China does want to impose export controls, it buys you a little bit more time, I suppose, to go through those negotiations. To what extent, how China will respond to Project Volt will be something that we're going to watch in the coming months.
I know there are reports that Europe is also planning its own stockpile. We're hearing it's a very EU division of labor. France financing, Germany sourcing, Italy storing. Is this a smart move, in your opinion, for Europe? I mean, is it going to work for the EU?
I think it's a long overdue move for the EU. I suppose the question is the EU going to move fast enough to create the strategic stockpile? Because some of these discussions have been going on for years, and we're yet to see decisive moves. Hopefully the EU realizes the urgency of the action. Whether they're going to move fast enough is something to watch.
Are there alternative sources for these minerals? I mean, U.S. President Trump, he has mentioned Greenland. Is Greenland a credible option?
I suppose it depends on the timeline that we're talking about, and it depends on how much money the U.S., for example, is willing to invest. Greenland has been open to investors for a long time, but there is a reason why those projects haven't gone ahead yet, because they're not commercially viable. So it depends on how much money they're willing to sink into some of those projects.
And I want to get back to President Trump for just a moment. He has aggressively pushed his America First policies, but we see that he will need international cooperation if he wants to counter Chinese dominance of these resources. How can he manage that challenge? I mean, multilateral today, unilateral tomorrow. You know, a lot of allies say he's speaking with a forked tongue many times.
I think it depends on how much allies want to move ahead on some of those projects and stockpiles, and to what extent that's going to be sort of a symbolic discussion, because it's unlikely that, for instance, in Germany, there's going to be much trust in that type of alliance, or perhaps it is seen as one of the ways to shore up an alliance with the US. But I suspect that given some of the rhetoric that's coming out from the US administration, there's going to be very little trust in creating that stockpile, and that the European allies would have access to when needed.
And I understand you have written that we are moving into a more unstable minerals era, more geopolitical pressure, not less. What do you see then is the single biggest risk in 2026 and beyond?
I think the race for my concern that the race for stockpiling is undermining some of the efforts that we're making in terms of transparency of those supply chains, because we are going to see a ramp up of geopolitical tensions over those raw materials. China is going to be publishing its 15th five-year plan, where it will outline which industries it is prioritizing, and China will require raw materials for those minerals. At the same time, we have the US buildup, we have the European buildup. All of those factors put pressure on supply chains, but they also mean that the cooperation in terms of transparency of those supply chains is probably declining. I think that creates a longer term risk over the quality of those supply chains and some of the downstream risk that creates in communities and in countries that are producing those minerals.
Okay. Olena Borodyna, we appreciate your time and your insights tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.